Hello and welcome to the Engerati studio here at the ENTSO-E annual conference Connecting the Dots. And we're joined now by Michael Walsh, who is the Vice President and MD of Europe for Smart Wires. Michael, welcome. We spoke before at last year's InnoGrid, and and that was an interesting conversation. But what I wanted to jump in on is that this year you were taking part in and moderating the microgrids panel. Tell us a little bit about what came out of that discussion. And microgrids mean a lot of things, so if you can put it into context as well. I mean, what sort of scale we're looking at, and what the conversation was about.
Yeah, so it was a fascinating conversation, and we had people from the large infrastructure area, people from citizens advice. And my one personal takeaway was just how uncertain things are. And I was reflecting on it a little bit afterwards. And if you watch the news now for a given week, we're generating more news now in a week than we used to in a month or a year. And we sort of become used to that. And humans were very adaptive. And we take this in the electricity industry, and we're now seeing microgrids are almost a real focal point for all this change. We've the empowerment of prosumers, we have storage, we've new technology, we've trading between peers. And big question is, what does this mean for the system as a whole, and particularly in an ENTSO-E context, what does this mean for the large infrastructure providers? And one takeaway was that the large infrastructure is important, but it's getting harder to predict what we're going to need. I think the discussion was very insightful yesterday. A lot of ideas generated both from the panel, from the audience. But if you were to try and say, okay, what were the clear takeaways that you can go and say, this is definitely what's going to happen in 5 years' time? I don't think they were there. I think everyone is...
On the microgrid side, though, do you think people actually understand the concept in its entirety? Because sometimes when I read things in the press, or you have talk of it, it almost seems to come across as it's an isolated grid, rather than what it really seems to be is that it's an area that is being managed very tightly as an isolated area, but it's not necessarily isolated, is it? It's still connected to the distribution grid, and it's more about a technology paradigm than a physical one. I mean, certainly in the European context.
So that's probably closer to how I see it as well.
Yeah.
But I think the way you've described it, you've covered a lot of different visions there, and they're all out there. And I think some of the more ambitious proponents of microgrids do envision an isolated world where they won't have a utility bill. Some of the more traditional industry people see it's really going to be much more limited interaction than that. And the reality is, the truth is going to be somewhere in between the two of those. But one way or the other, from a European standpoint, secure energy is going to be important. Quality of supply is going to be important. Cost is going to be important. Citizens are going to want, infrastructure and it delivered in a way that's acceptable to them and has minimal impact on their environment. And in the middle of all this, you've got the traditional utilities, and they're in a world where they've all these different visions and how it's going to play out, and they're trying to make plans. And traditionally, they looked at infrastructure that was going to last 40, 50 years, and they'd plan it 10 years in advance, take 10 years to build it, and it would do the job for 40 years. And now they're under pressure from all these angles, the prosumers, regulators who want costs down, innovative companies who want them to try new things. And they're trying to make all this work on the traditional model. And it's a very, very difficult place for them to be.
And it's difficult because they've got this, and I wrote about this recently, this very long-term relationship with technology rather than an iterative, progressive relationship with technology. Is that why it's so difficult? I mean, when we come down to your solution, your solution would have in the past had its perfect home in the transmission side of the grid, but now it's moving further and further downstream, closer and closer to home, right? That's a whole new thing as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting one, and so our solutions work by pushing and pulling power on alternative paths. So when you look at networks, they tend to have very low utilization factors, below 25% in most parts of the world. And the problem is you're getting one path being overloaded, and that's stopping everything. Our solutions allow you to back the power off that path and use parallel ones. That traditionally worked best in a transmission environment at the high voltage where you had a mesh grid and lots of different parallel paths for it to flow on. What we're seeing now with some of the microgrid development is much more connected up thinking at the distribution network, where they're starting to close up points that were being opened before. They're looking at new solutions. And what we found is the work we've put in to make our solutions effective at transmission have made them just incredibly powerful at distribution. So it's almost it almost surprised us when we went back and started looking at some distribution cases, quite how powerful and economic we were at solving these new problems and challenges that were coming out.
So going back to what you said at the top to join things up a little bit, are you though still seeing that people are they open to the adoption of these new technologies? I mean, is the culture changing? I mean, you mentioned it at the top. There's a very traditional way of running this business, and we're not doing a broad brush here. There's some very, very progressive companies out there, absolutely. But by and large, when you hear the commentary around this industry, it's about, plan for 15 years and so on, rather than having this iterative approach. When you guys come along with what is, I mean, it's not new, but a newish use case in the distribution going, is the culture open to that sort of thing, or do we in the energy sector still need to move more towards an open culture, towards new technology and innovation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's moving in the right direction, but it's a long way to travel. We are seeing, some companies being particularly innovative. So, and not disparaging, but some of the ones we deal with, like UK Power Networks, RTE in France, EirGrid in Ireland, they're incredibly progressive and they're open to new ideas, working with you, and they have a very action-based and structured approach. So they will actually take an idea and have the conversation and put in place, okay, to do the next step, here are the things we need to do. And that to us seems to work really well, and it gives them a chance to learn, and we learn as well as we go through that journey.
It's a proper partnership.
It's a proper partnership,
Yeah.
but it goes from, concept to action. It's, you have the meetings and then you decide, okay, if we are going to use your solution, we need to know, how does this work, and it's very structured, and it makes, over the space of 6 months or a year, they get a new tool in their toolkit that can help them solve problems. We learn what are the little issues they need to understand, and we can work and develop those. And with those three companies, that's worked incredibly well for us. What we find with a lot of others is maybe, you have a great conversation and there's a strategic interest, there's a technical interest, but it doesn't go into, these people are incredibly busy. And unless you, decide, okay, I'm going to actually do something here, it doesn't happen. And just broaden that a little bit. When you look at the challenges utilities are facing, and some of the problems they're facing, and the business model disruption, they're worrying about the data, and Google and Facebook having much more data on their customers than they do. A lot of them are terrified, when are they going to enter? And the risk is they become paralyzed by that and they just do nothing. And they have an awareness that all these other things are out there. And what I think my personal view at this stage is they need to maybe look at some of these big problems, and even if they can't solve them in their totality, start taking 1 or 2 steps, because those first few steps you will learn so much more than you will by reading reports or journals or.
Do you think that there needs to be a redefinition around value? We did an excellent webinar recently on asset management, and the gist of it was you need to anchor around value that everybody can articulate, because it seems to me that if the way you've traditionally built a distribution network, which is very infrastructure based, if you carry on that way, you're going to end up with an over-engineered network in terms of copper wires and everything that goes with it, rather than using some of the smart technology that you guys and others have in terms of your statistic earlier on. Most networks are utilized at 25%, right? Moving it up to 50% could be a good thing. Do you think that the skill set is there within these organizations to articulate that value across everybody? Because the last time we spoke, you said that everybody seems to have a veto, right? So how do you break that?
And you've hit probably one of the single most important issues facing the whole industry. It's the value. And how do you make a decision? And the traditional model is even worse than the one you describe. The traditional way that it's done is people look and they make a guess at what the world is going to look like in 20 years' time, which is brave.
Yeah, good luck with that.
And then they put in a fixed plan to respond to that, and they work out the value in that. What they don't do is look at all the other different things that could happen, how likely are they, and how resilient is your solution to delivering those. And they also don't look at issues around how much cost they're spending. Are their customers going to leave their grid and leave them with this huge bill of stranded infrastructure spend, as you say, an awful lot of copper underperforming. And the value is key to this, and it's not just the utility companies, it's also the regulators and how they reward them, because in most parts of the world still you have this model where the more money you spend on copper, the more you earn, the better your profits are. And that's broken. And what we want to see is, something like the way the UK is moving, Italy are moving in this direction, where the focus is on what benefit are you giving to your consumers, to your service providers? Are you facilitating trade? Are you helping the renewable transition? And the better you're doing in those metrics should reflect how well you value solutions and are remunerated, not which is the most expensive solution I can get a regulator to sign off on.
Because that attitude rewards efficiency, doesn't it? And Michael, I'm just conscious of time as well, but I do want to drill into this. Is the adoption of new technology and the way it's been adopted is one of those things which is a regular thing we hear on camera, sometimes a bit more off camera, that actually that relationship with technology needs to change. Certain things need to start moving on a much shorter life cycle, because like you said, it's a brave person who can predict the world in 20 years' time. You're on the ground, you're selling these technologies into the businesses. Are you starting to see a change, or is it still fairly early days in that change?
I think it's early days, and the watchword or the buzzword everyone has now is flexibility. But flexibility, it's almost like the microgrid. It means different things to different people. And when I think about it, I think there's two elements to the flexibility that the network companies need to think of. The first is how they manage their companies, because if your company is set up to do next year what you did last year and the year before, you're not going to be responding to the challenges, the opportunities, the circumstances that are coming out there. But secondly, it's flexibility in what assets and tools you have available to you. If your solutions and your toolbox is full of things that take 3-4 years to deploy and need to be paid for and have to stay there and have people pay for them for 40 years. It's not just that they stay there, they're sitting on your bill for 40 years. That's going to be a very, very cold place to be in a few years' time. But if you take a more flexible approach where you bring in solutions that you can deploy really, really quickly, that if your needs change, you can move them from one part of your system to another part or to a completely different system, that's going to give you a lot more opportunity to respond to the challenges you have next year, the year after, And at SmartWires, that's what we're investing all our thoughts in, is how can we make our solutions even more mobile? How can we get them from solutions you can move in a month to solutions you can move in 2 weeks? How can we make them more modular so that, if your need increases by 10-15%, you can just dial up your solution. If your need decreases, make sure you can reuse that investment somewhere else on your grid.
Or are you even going down the road of selling it as a service, that if someone says, listen, I need 5 more, here you go, I need it for a month, okay, here you go, you don't need it, take it back?
Yeah, I think we're open to that, and I think part of our issue is when you go into the utilities, they're used to buying capital equipment, putting it on a rate base.
So you come up against procurement.
We come across procurement, we come across other issues. Yeah. But the idea of taking it and turning it more into an operating type environment where there's a lease model and all, like we're very open to it. Yeah. But we are context, we do need to do it in a way that helps the utilities move. So it's something we're certainly very open to. Yeah. And maybe that's where the future lies.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe on that note, we'll leave it. It's a good place to leave it, because I'm pretty sure we'll be talking again, so that we can do all of that later on.
Right?
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you as well for watching.